I'm just going on record and for the public notice that my daughter is yet to come claim her paintings out of my office. And it's probably best that I start the video this way instead of with my mouth hanging open in the opening picture. What I want to do today is discuss teacher liability, defamation of character as it particularly applies to teachers, and then end with the responsibilities of educators in relation to reporting child abuse. And I will go in that order. Tort law, and if any of your parents are lawyers and specialize in tort reform or tort law, civil liability, then by all means I defer to them. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a tort expert by any means, but historically courts have maintained that school districts and school board members acting in good faith are not liable for injuries to students or teachers that were results of errors of judgment. And the idea there that governments are sovereign entities, and that money designated for schools should not go to private non-educational ends. However, there had been, I think, after the Second World War, I want to say in the 1950s. I'd have to look at this, and I should have done this before I started this video. Somewhere in the 1950s, after the Second World War, there had been tort law reform that recognized government response, that made it possible to sue governments in liability cases, in cases of civil injury, civil liability, in cases of injury, emotional injury. And in fact, every year in this state, as well as many other states, schools will send home in loco parentis forms, which basically the parent will sign over. It's a legal form. I'm sure many of your parents have signed this before, and if you're a parent, I'm sure you're signing these. It basically turns over legally turns over the responsibility for the physical well-being and emotional well-being to the staff of schools or educators. So what is the criteria, the set of criteria that is required, or by which we determine cases of liability when teachers and educators are liable for injuries to students? And what I thought I would do today is to simply go through a number of concrete cases. I'll keep it to a few, but and if you've had my class before, you know that these are cases that I commonly use. In December of 1970, I started seventh grade in the 1978-1979 school year. Our seventh grade was having the seventh grade wing of our school was being renovated, and so the entire seventh grade was relocated in portables at the edge of an athletic field on the school grounds, which amounted in terms of distance a good ways, about almost a quarter of a mile away from the main building of the school. And our teachers, when we started the first part of the year, had mapped out ways, in order to maintain student safety, ways in and out of the building in a protocol, steps. For instance, if we left in mass, we were to be in single file, 2 seconds apart, if not 3 seconds apart. Maybe it was 3 seconds apart from each other. There were various collecting points along the way. That is, the teacher would stop us at, maybe two places before we got into the main entrance of the building, in order to allow the line to collect. That is, come together and make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to. No talking, and no horseplay, as they called it. This went home. This note went home. These protocols and rules went home to parents. Parents signed, students signed, took a test, we demonstrated. 3 or 4 months into this, I think around December of 1978, we were on our way into lunch one day, and the final stopping point was the door that led right into the school cafeteria from the outside, and because of the construction work, separating the walkway right up to the door was a fence, chain link fence with two barbs sticking out of each link at the top. It was probably about a 6 foot, maybe an 8 foot fence. I was little, so it was hard to tell. And right as we were approaching the door, a student kicks my legs out from under me. And in order to break my fall, I reached to catch myself on the fence and jab. You can't see it anymore. I'm 50 years old. Jab that fence, the top of that fence, through my hand, in my hand and almost through the back of it. Now, is the teacher liable for that injury? How do you determine? Same school year, but in a different part of South Carolina. I grew up in the state of South Carolina as a young kid. In Charleston, South Carolina. Young girl goes to the fourth grader goes to the pencil sharpener right as the bell rings, sharpens her pencil and sits back down. As she sits back down, a student from behind her, a classic prank, pulls the chair out from under her such that she falls backwards. But in doing so, she hits the back of her head on the edge of the desk behind her, knocking her unconscious. Is the teacher responsible for that injury? Again, how do you decide? Aren't teachers supposed to watch students at all times? Constant supervision. There's several other examples that I want to bring up because it gets at some of the things I want to discuss later in terms of liability. I think it was in the 1990s in the state of Louisiana. An AP class, an AP teacher sends home a course syllabus to parents for them to look over, sign, and return. Students themselves had to look over it, sign, and then take a test on said syllabus. The syllabus laid out what the nature of the course, the thematic framework of the course, what the students will do, that is, what they will read, their assignments for the year. Part of the responsibility of students was to keep a journal over the course of the year related to the literature that they had read, that they would be reading. The second 9 weeks, the second 9 weeks of school, the class focused on 20th century poets. The first of which was Sylvia Plath. Now, if any of you know Sylvia Plath or know about Sylvia Plath, I think she committed suicide by way of sticking her head in an oven. Well, not too long after reading Sylvia Plath, a student in her very class did the same thing, killed herself by basically sticking her head into a propane or gas powered oven. Parents, upon collecting, going through their daughter's things, found her school journal in which she had strongly intimated that she was going to commit suicide. Is the teacher liable for that death? A couple of not personal but close friend examples. It comes from shop. One of my friends was a shop teacher in both Fort White, Florida, in the 90s, and in a shop teacher at Eastside High School. Two examples from him that are relevant. The Fort White case In the Fort White example, he had shop two, whatever shop two is. I don't know what that means. I'm sure they're older kids, and they've had the benefits of shop one, which probably emphasized safety, safety, safety. Uh, anyway, shop two kids. He was helping Friday afternoon. Last period, he was wandering around the room. Well, he wasn't wandering around the room. He was in the back. The setup first. I'm sorry. Shop class, shop two. He had several stations. Various equipment, drill presses, miter saws, circular saws, table saws, and so on. He was at the back of the shop room helping a student finish a project for an art competition that they were going to attend the very next day, the entire class. And it had something to do with artwork made out of garbage. And what they were doing, the class was basically specializing in, was creating Ashiko drums out of pallets. He would go to Publix, various places and get pallets, and they would work that wood, break it apart and work that wood, and then form it into Ashiko drums. Very good at it. But he had his back turned to the rest of the class, helping a student to get his project ready, when he hears this, commotion, blood curdling scream behind him. 2 stations up, a student with his partner had lifted. He was working on a miter saw, a compound miter saw, and lifted the guard of the compound miter saw, and was trying to basically singe off wood from a little pipe that he was making out of a arm of a couch that they had found on the side of the road. So he was just singeing off wood to kind of form his pipe. When he hits the blade grabs, it didn't sever his finger, but it cut into his finger. Now, is the teacher responsible for that injury? It is true, he had his back. He even admitted he had his back turned toward the class. Same shop teacher, different time. When he moves to a different school, Gainesville, I think it was Eastside High School back in the day when they still had shop, he inherited a wonderful shop room. He showed up in July, got the job, shows up in July just to check what he had in his shop. Although he finds out during that check that one of the electrical sockets that serviced or that provided a power source to one of his 3 of his saws were faulty. I think 2 or 3 of those electrical sockets were not working. Now, he was a licensed electrician. He could fix them himself, but that was not the protocol. He had to send in a work order, and then the maintenance department had to come out and fix it. So he fills out a work order and files it in July. They start back to school in August. They're not fixed. He can move on and do other things. October, I think around October, he files another work order. So he's filed the initial work order again in October. And then by November, he needs the power sources to work because he needs the stations. And I think it was a table saw, 2 table saws, and something else, miter saw. I don't know what the third one was, but the 2 table saws, he needed them because of projects they were to complete. So he files another work order in November. No one came, and so 3 attempts, no one budged on fixing it. So he makeshifts it, so to speak. He runs electrical drop cords, extension cords from each of the stations out and out the door, which was behind the third unit, out the door, and there was a series of electrical sockets, and he was going to get his electrical power for those machines outside the door. And so he tells the students what the protocol would be, that at the start of the class period, all the students were to check to see if all the machines were in the off position, the switches were off, and that the electrical cord from the machine was not plugged in to the extension cord. He would go out, plug it in, come back in, and tell them, you're ready to plug it in, and then cut the machine on, or use the machine. He sent a letter. He instructed the students of this protocol, as to this protocol. He demonstrated it. They demonstrated it. Note went home to parents. This routine went on for the better part all of November and well into December. About 2 days before Christmas holidays or winter holidays, same routine they had followed almost for 2 months. He goes out. All right, I'm going to do, he lets them know he's going out the door to plug in the equipment. As soon as he plugs the first one in, again, blood curdling scream. He comes back in, blood splattered all over the wall. Turns out that just as routine, two kids were talking about what they were going to do over the Christmas break together, standing at a table saw. They had plugged, before he got out the door, they had already plugged it in, just out of a matter of routine. They had already plugged the machine in, and whoever had left, whoever had the class beforehand had left the machine. They didn't check the machine. It was left to the on position. So when he plugged in the electrical cord out back, a student was, the machine started up, and one of the students was kind of mindlessly talking to his friend, but had his two fingers, his index and his thumb, kind of screwing around with the blade, holding the blade, and of course it gnawed off meat, but it didn't sever his fingers. Teacher responsible for that injury. Another physical example, Arkansas, a 2-story, 3-story high school, first floor students are coming into school, changing classes first to second period, when the girls' locker room door swings open into a crowded hallway and hits a student in the eye, permanently damaging her skull and her eye socket and her eye. Another example in your book, similarly, elementary school student is on the playground and swings from a set of monkey bars to a tetherball pole that is located really close to the monkey bars. She jumps to the pole, slides down the pole, yet her inner thigh is torn up by a bolt that sticks through the tetherball pole, sticking out of the tetherball pole. Is the school teacher and or school liable for that injury? One last one. Students, two students, again, I don't know what that means. This is a case from Los Angeles. South Central, students at an Art 2 class, high school Art 2 class, went to a art festival, art show in South Central Los Angeles somewhere. There were an adequate number of chaperones for about 50 students. The teachers allowed the students to break off into pairs or small groups of 3, I forget, I'd have to look at the detail, and allowed them to walk around the exhibits themselves. They had they had to return or check in or collecting times of 10 o'clock. They started at 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and at lunch, and then again right before they went home at 2-ish. Somewhere between the 10 o'clock check-in time and noon, two of the students in the program or in that Art 2 class or went on the vacation were arrested for attempting to buy marijuana. Is the school or the school officials, the teachers in particular, but the school officials responsible for the arrests? Again, what is the protocol, or not protocol? What is the criteria? What is the set of criteria necessary to determine teacher and school government liability? Well, the precedent case is the Margaret Sheehan case heard by the Minnesota Supreme Court in 1971. The incident happened May 6, 1966, but I'm going to show you two court cases here that are important in terms of liability. The first is Sheehan versus St. Peter's Catholic School, which is 1971. And then the Maka versus the Field Museum of Natural History is a case that provides qualifications on what will be, you will see in a minute, reasonable care. The Margaret Sheehan case, again, is the precedent. Margaret Sheehan was an 8th grader in 1966. Margaret Sheehan was an 8th grader who was led along with 20 other students during the morning recess to athletic fields where a group of 8th grade boys were playing baseball. The teacher has the girls, I guess, sit along the third base line on a log, and then immediately returns to the school for whatever reason. After 5 minutes, or roughly 5 minutes after the teacher returned back to left, the boys started to pick up small rocks, pebbles, rocks from off the infield, and began throwing them at each other, and of course throwing them at the girls. At which point Margaret Sheehan was hit in the eye, permanently damaging her sight, her vision. Her family filed suit. The case makes it to the Minnesota Supreme Court. Let me just tell you what the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled. The court in this case noted 4 conditions that have to be met. 4 conditions, and this is the criteria. 4 conditions that have to be met in order to establish liability. First, the teacher had a duty to be careful not to injure the student and to protect the student from injury. Second, the teacher failed to use due, D-U-E, or reasonable care. And that's the main principle here. Not negligence, it's reasonable care. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. 3, teacher carelessness caused the injury. And 4, the student sustained provable damages. Now, reasonable care, the court noted in this case that reasonable care is the degree of care or concern a teacher of ordinary prudence would have used under similar circumstances. Now, circumstances always matter in terms of experience and in terms of age. You can be young but have plenty of experience, or old and have no experience. Age and experience matter. The court ruled it is the duty of the school to use ordinary care and to protect its students from injury resulting from the conduct of other students under circumstances where such conduct would reasonably have been foreseen and could have been prevented by the use of ordinary care. Again, the court noted in this particular case, the teacher's very physical presence, by virtue of positional authority, probably would have prevented the boys from picking up rocks to begin with. So as that is as a condition of just to preclude it altogether. And had she been there, she would have been able to stop it immediately when danger does arise. Now, what does this mean for some of the cases that I've identified? Well, the court noted in the Sheehan case that even with the presence of an authority figure, that doesn't mean that students will not engage in dangerous behavior, things that they can't foresee or they haven't thought of before. Recognize that children often will act in ways such that consequences are not part of the decision-making process. They're spontaneous, in other words. So danger can happen, or dangerous acts can happen spontaneously, that the teacher cannot foresee. And so in those cases, such as the student kicking my legs out from under me, or my feet out from under me, and my hand going through the fence, or the student pulling the chair out from under another student, those things can't be foreseen, and therefore the teacher is not liable for such actions. In terms of the English teacher in the AP class in which the student commits suicide, well, in the syllabus, the teacher had noted that the entries the teacher had noted that the journals would be checked periodically and at random. The court noted that it is quite unfortunate that this young woman committed suicide. Yet it is not the teacher's. In this case, the teacher is not responsible for the death, insofar as she simply had not had a chance to read this young lady's journal entries. Had the teacher known about it, had read the journals and did nothing about it, she would have been held liable for that death. And this has just as much to do with child protection and reporting child abuse. Civil authorities know something about harm to children. They are obligated by law to inform their proper authorities or face penalty. And this would have been true in the teacher's case had she read the journal entry. I always tell a story. I was in college, a sophomore in college, taking a literature class, and we were given some. I don't know what poet we were reading, but we were given the task of emulating the poet's style, and I created some I don't know, sonnet or something entitled "The Resignation of Life." I'm just completing the assignment. Well, I turned that paper in, and by day's end, the university police are knocking at my, along with the professor, are knocking at my dorm room door. They had to check. They had to check. Now, how about the shop teacher? The shop examples. It is, the court noted in the Sheehan case, that certain conditions require an extra burden or extra vigilance or extra burden of supervision, certain conditions and activities. That just makes sense. Chemistry. Anytime you're working with a kiln, knitting needles, weights, knives, and home ec, again, chemicals, and so on. There's an extra burden of supervision because those conditions increase the possibility of injury. In such cases, the extra burden of supervision is typically met by a written list of protocol or rules related to the operation of heavy equipment, operation of the dangerous equipment, the equipment. Those list of rules will be given to students They will have a test. The teacher will go over such rules, demonstrate such rules, have students demonstrate such rules. They will take a test on the procedures, and with a, I don't know, 75% passing rate. A notice along with the rules will go home to parents, who will sign such a notice in return if they want their students to participate. That's typically how the extra burden of proof is met in relation to some of these special conditions. Now, in the case of the shop teacher, was not held liable in either of those cases, and here's why. He, the student in the first case, in which the students lift the guard, well, they violated it wasn't that he had his back to them. Again, the court noted in the Sheehan case, teachers, they can't constantly watch their students. There will be a time at which their backs will have to turn. The burden of constantly supervising students would prevent a lot of activities that go on in the name of education from ever happening. Hopscotch, as the court noted as an example. But in this case, the student he violated the protocol, the safety procedures, by opening the guard to begin with, and thus he was the source of the injury, and thus carries the entire burden of the injury. In the case of the student, who was fingering the table saw blade, the school board was held somewhat liable. I'll get to defenses against liability. Comparable negligence was evoked in this particular case, insofar as the teacher was not held liable. The school board was, to a certain degree, simply because it failed to repair broken equipment. The teacher was not in this particular case. He had taken every safety precaution necessary, yet the students, again in this case, didn't follow it. So they were also held a certain percentage liable. Of course, in cases cases of injury that should have been foreseen, such as the door opening into a hallway. If you'll notice, most doors will have insets such that when the door does open, it's not opening into a crowded hallway, or stops that allows it not to go a certain distance and so forth, opens inward, whatever. The case in which the student jumps from monkey bars to tetherball pole, that should have been foreseen. That danger should have been foreseen. The case in which the students are arrested at the art show was the school's fault, and here's why. And this will segue into the Roberto Manca case right here. The students had adequate. The teachers had adequate chaperone for the 50 students. They were perfectly entitled. Their safety protocols were adequate. However, the teachers should have provided more supervision, the court claimed in this case, because the art show was held in an area known for criminal activity, particularly drug sales. And so should have, if schools know of danger yet don't take proper precautions, or the precautions necessary to stave off or to protect students against those conditions, then they were often held liable for arrest, injury, and so on. So in that particular case, the teachers were held liable. Now, in the Roberto Manca case, and this is similar to the last case I've just to the art case, Roberto Manca was part of a middle school class which was composed of about 50 students, 2 chaperones, and they went to 12 to 15-year-olds, I think, went to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. a place of, I mean, if you've ever been, I've never been to the Field Museum of Natural History, but University of Florida has something similar to that. Not quite that big, of course. Um, uh, um, that's similar. A place of of education, science education, and so forth. And in the Monca case, the teachers allowed the students to wonder about the exhibits on their own, again with collecting times and so forth. At some point, and it allowed them to group themselves into however they wanted to. Monca put himself in a group with African American children, and was called names by Caucasian kids older than him, and then beaten up. His parents filed suit, claiming that the school didn't provide enough chaperones, and of course didn't protect their child. The court in this particular case, however, ruled in favor of the teachers, and the court maintained. Where are my notes, man? Maintained in this particular case. Oh, here we go. One, there are two qualifications on reasonable care. One, the likelihood of injury. And in this particular case, the likelihood of a student being beaten up in an educational institution such as the Field Museum of Natural History was quite low. That is, the teachers took proper, reasonable care in attempting to, in considering the probability that such an injury would occur, which would be low. And then the second qualification is the magnitude of burden of guarding against injury. That is, the magnitude of constant supervision. Teachers can't watch students all the time. I'll give you an example of magnitude of burden in a second. There was back in the 1980s. In the state of South Carolina, and I forget. I think it was not governor. He wasn't a governor at the time, but Carroll Campbell was a state legislator, a U.S. representative, and he had this program, and I forget the name of the program now. But he would identify, or schools would identify two rising seniors, that is, going from 11th grade into the 12th grade, to go on a week-long field trip to D.C. On behalf of the representative. They were the students from each high school in his district. Two students from each high school in his district. There were orientation dates to be met, at which students were given material that outlined what they would wear and how they would act, and proper, curfews and all this. Again, with a test and so forth. The students go they go on the field trip and are staying. I don't recall where they were staying, but they were staying in a hotel. They had bed checks or room checks. They had to be in at 9 o'clock every night, unless they were doing something as part of the field trip, an organized activity. They had, I think they had to be in their rooms by 9, and then they had a bed check at 11. After the 11 o'clock bed check, two girls wanted to run down, and it wasn't very far, 75 yards from the hotel to a convenience store to get snacks so they could watch television. Now, they had to be in their beds, but they didn't have to be asleep. They could watch television. And so slipped out of the hotel, but in order to get to the store, well, it doesn't matter how, they were sexually assaulted. Is the program, or the educators or staff in that program, responsible for that assault, those assaults, the injuries? The court decided that they were not liable, citing the magnitude of constant burden. They took every conceivable caution with 2 bed checks, and that the students violated the protocol. Okay. Three. I'm gonna name. I'm gonna list three. I don't have them written down here. I apologize. Three defenses against claims of liability. The first is something will you will recognize right off and pretty easily, and that is assumption of risk. I'm sorry. Assumption of risk. Students sign assumption of risk waivers that acknowledge, such that students acknowledge the dangers inherent in some activity. I mean, if you've played any sport, you know that sometimes people get injured, even if we take the best precautions. People get injured, and so students. Assumption of risk waives the school of any liability for injuries incurred by virtue of engaging in that activity, injuries that are inherent to the activity. That doesn't absolve schools or school officials from taking proper safety precautions. Adequate water breaks, protecting students against lightning, proper rest, and so forth. I mean, in other words, reasonable care still applies, but there are injuries that even when staff set the conditions such that so as to foresee, or sets such that when the staff creates conditions conducive to some particular end, injuries do apply. They still have to maintain reasonable care and so forth. So assumption of risk is one defense against liability. Second is contributory or comparative negligence. Contributory or comparative negligence. These defenses are in your textbook. And this particular defense, courts will assign. They have a formula, a percentage of liability to contributing parties. I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, I graduated from high school in 1984, but the year before, I think it was the year before, 1982, 83 school year, my homeroom, this is back when we had homeroom. My homeroom teacher was the art teacher, and he was on the first floor of a 3-story building. And every morning at 8 o'clock, every teacher had hall duty. They had to move outside the hall and shepherd students along, getting to homeroom and so forth. And his room down on the first floor hall had a series of lockers, a long series of lockers right up to his door, and then about 5 top to bottom, top and bottom lockers, and then a column, basically, pipe from the top that run from the third floor to the first floor, ran down, but they wrapped it in drywall, made a column out of it. And then on the other side, that stuck out such that you couldn't see the other side, on the other side of that column very well unless you stepped outward to look around that column. And then the lockers continue on the other side of the column. Well, I think it was moving from second 9 weeks to the third 9 weeks, or third 9 weeks to the fourth. I can't remember, but it was the day report cards were to be issued, and this was back when teachers filled them out by hand in homeroom. Well, he was attempting to get his report cards filled out, and didn't stand outside the hallway. And we were already sitting inside. Well, on the other side of that column was this gentleman who liked to basically suck butane in from lighters. Lighters. The butane that's in the lighters. The old Kiss or Gene Simmons trick. It's sucking the butane, light the flame, and blow it, and it'd blow a plume of fire. Well, remember, this is 1983. His girlfriend wore a lot of hairspray. He did that one morning, this particular morning in question, and set his girlfriend's hair on fire. And of course, the screaming alerted the teacher, who wasn't out there when he was supposed to be out there. He runs out there, and he gives the girl a concussion, attempting to beat out what he perceived to be, or he was informed of, a fire on her head. Well, is the teacher liable for that injury? Well, in a comparative or a contributory or comparative negligence formula or defense, he was found, I don't know, 30-something% liable, but not for the concussion that the student received. That's back to the what's the Good Samaritan law? If he's attempting to save her life, he ends up hurting her. Well, his intention was certainly to save her, but his responsibility was not carrying through with his morning obligations of hall duty. The student who sucked in the butane and, of course, set the fire was held liable for the injury, was the source. So you have assumption of risk, contributory or comparative negligence is the second defense against liability, claims of liability, and thirdly, governmental immunity. And governmental immunity is granted under the subpart 5 of the No Child Left Behind law. It's often goes by the name of Paul Coverdell, Coverdell. Paul Coverdell Teacher Protection Act. And then it basically absolves teachers from liability in cases of injury, or more importantly, misdiagnosis. That is, if they misdiagnose students for educational treatment, as long as they were acting in good faith, they will not be held liable. And if you look at the Paul Coverdell Teacher Protection Act, I think there's only been one case in which governmental immunity was used, and that had something to do with a principal in a school in, I want to say, Kansas City, Arkansas. You can look that up. Okay. That will do it for liability right now. Let me go to defamation of character. This should be chapter 6. The precedent case is as follows, and I'll tell you how and why here in a second. Elizabeth Pitka, Fairbanks Publishing Company versus Pitka, 1962. The case came about in 1957, I believe, or the issue or the incident did. Now, just quickly, I'm sorry. What constitutes libel and slander? What does it mean to defame? Okay, to defame, to injure or damage a person's character or reputation by false or malicious statement. To injure or damage a person's character or reputation by false or malicious statement, such that one is opened up to hatred, shame, disgrace, contempt, or ridicule. Spoken defamation is slander. Written defamation is libel. Libel. The precedent case here is Elizabeth Pitka, and you can look this up on a Google search yourself, but if I can remember the particulars, Elizabeth Pitka was a head teacher and teacher at a school in North Pole, Alaska, which is just outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. In August of 1957, she sends a letter of resignation to the school board. Sorry, let me get some coffee. To the school board. Upon the school board's request, she rescinds her letter of recommendation. In October of the very same year, just a few months later, she sends it again. She rescinds the letter of resignation, saying that she will resign effectively in, I think, 20 days, 10 days, not 10 days, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 14 days, something like that. At which point, the school board, which had a meeting the day that she sent her, I think it was October 7th, they had a meeting, October 7th or October 8th. The school board held a meeting and sent her back notice that she is resigned effective immediately. That is, you just go ahead and collect your stuff. Your termination is now, instead of waiting the days that Pika stipulated in her letter. Pika insisted that she continue those days and showed up from October 7th or 8th to October 18th. The October 18th was the day was another meeting. Another meeting of the school board. School board meeting was held, at which point the board sent her another letter, or after which the board sent her another letter saying that if she returned to the school, she would be arrested for trespassing. Now, this was October 18th, 1957, was a Friday. She shows back up to school on a Monday, the 21st, at which point she is met by a school board member who happened to also be the sheriff. Pika knew that something like this would happen, so she had contacted reporters from the Fairbanks Post or Fairbanks newspaper, whatever it was, to show up. And she goes in to get her, goes back into the school, and sure enough, the school board / sheriff arrests her for trespassing and disturbing the peace, or something like that, trespassing. And Pika is talking to the reporters for the newspaper, and the headline, the next paper's issue paper's headline reads this way: North Pole teacher fights board. Territorial police called to expel fired school marm. Now, Pika filed suit saying this was slander, not slander, libel, written defamation. That the title stated things that were not true. First of all, she didn't get in the fight. Second of all, she wasn't fired. Well, in the first, I guess the district court took this up, a local court or district court took this up and said that you're right, she didn't get in a fight. She wasn't fighting, and she wasn't fired. I think Alaska Supreme Court of Alaska finally heard the case and said, well, fighting can be taken figuratively. That is, we can be in an argument and be considered a fight. It doesn't have to be physical. The key in this liability case turns on fired, and there's dispute about that. I mean, it is true that Pika resigned. The school board just said, you can be resigned effective now instead of the 10 days or whatever day, how many days she stipulated. And so they found in Pika's favor, but in doing so, they laid out, I think, four criterion that constitutes defamation on the surface of things, prima facie, on the surface of, or per se, or on the surface of things. One, if the statement or the defamation imputes criminal offense. For example, Hewitt got this job because he blackmailed the president or something of the university. If the statement imputes loathsome disease. 3, if it imputes lack of morality. If the statement disparages professional competence. If it's a false malicious statement. And of course, the court noted in this case that the absolute truth is a defense against claims of defamation, as long as the absolute truth is not used to deliberately injure another person. I might be telling the absolute truth, but if it can be proven, now the burden's back on you to prove that I'm going after you with this absolute truth, that I'm out to injure your character or reputation. And of course, this mattered to Pitka because if she was fired, it would go on her record, and that would harm her ability or affect her ability to be employed at a later date by another school or school board and so forth. Why does any of this matter to teachers? Now, just in limited cases, first of all, I mean the obvious is be careful what you teachers as teachers what you say and who you say it to. Keep your gossip very close to yourself if you're going to engage in it. And I know I've done it myself, and I'm someone who is not a gossiper. But teachers get into the drama of the job situation. It's a means of having something to do. Maybe not right, but it's a fact of the matter, which is true of any job situation. And things get said. It's merely gossip and unproven and so forth. In teachers' lounges and cafeterias, between teachers, behind closed doors, that can often, and doing so can often open teachers up for claims of defamation of character, to defame and students who. Defaming students, parents, and so forth. Be very careful about that. But more importantly, teachers will write, are often called, as part of their duty, called on to write letters of recommendation for students, recommendation for colleagues, and recommendations for administrators, and vice versa. Administrators are often called upon to, or as part of their job function, or function of their job, to write letters of recommendation and so forth, to exercise their judgment or to express their judgment as to the competency of teacher, student, and so on. And under the idea, a concept of qualified privilege, which gives immunity to teachers, principals, in carrying out their function of expressing judgment as to the capacities of another professional. In my recommendation, in a principal's recommendation, he or she may get something factually wrong about a teacher, that could harm his or the teacher's reputation as a teacher. But as long as the principal, even though the principal may have, the principal may have misspoken or gotten his or her facts wrong, as long as he or she was acting in good faith, that is, wasn't intentionally attempting to harm the teacher's reputation, then he or she would be covered or given immunity for false facts, or qualified privilege. Qualified privilege only covers the teacher or principal when carrying out his or her duties to comment upon, evaluate another's professional competency. It does not extend to judgments about the person upon whom the principal or teacher is commenting. That is, if I'm writing a letter of recommendation for a student, and I comment, and that letter is related solely to my judgment of the student's competencies as a student, that's one thing. But as soon as that judgment slips into my commentary on the student as a person, then I've crossed the bounds, or the bounds of immunity covered that is granted by qualified privilege, and it would open me up to defamation of character or libel in the case of written. That's how. This is the application of defamation of character to teachers. Now, last thing, dealing with child abuse. Your textbook has your textbook will have, bear with me a second, find it. Will have the physical indicators and behavioral indicators of child abuse. There's a definition of child abuse in the text. In the textbook. I don't know. I can't remember what pages this is on anymore. The U.S. government, each state will have a definition of child abuse. The U.S. Congress has defined child abuse that most states have adopted. Abused child means a child whose physical or mental health or welfare is harmed or threatened with harm by acts or omissions of his parents and other persons responsible for his welfare. Well, anyway, your textbook will have one of the physical and behavioral indicators of child abuse. Become very familiar with those. You will also, as part of an in-service, when you start, as a part of an in-service orientation, when you start schools, will have exposure to behavioral and physical indicators of child abuse. But there are a couple things that you need to know by way of Florida law. There's a protocol, and it's important to know what this protocol is, because it can often, or it has at least in the past, not knowing what it is has opened up teachers for not properly reporting child abuse, and they face arrest. If you go to the Florida Department of Education website, and in the search box simply type in reporting child abuse, you will come upon the documents that I have. This is just the second page of this, but you'll come upon the documents that I have in my hand here. 777. I don't know what statute it is. Florida Statute 39.201 requires that professional persons who include all school personnel, including in performance of other duties, those personnel under contract, report any suspected child abuse to the Department of Child and Family Services. To meet this requirement, teachers and staff shall familiarize themselves with the various indicators of child abuse included in their school handbook. That's important to note. And who are these people who must report child abuse? Physician, osteopath, medical examiner, chiropractor, nurse, hospital personnel engaged in the admission, examination, care, or treatment of persons. Health or mental health professional other than listed in number 1. 3. Practitioner who relies solely on spiritual means for healing. 4. School teacher or other school official or personnel. 5. Social worker, daycare center worker, other professional child care, foster care, residential or institutional worker. Or 6. Law enforcement officer. In this case, each report of known or suspected child abuse or neglect pursuant to this section shall be made immediately to the department's abuse registry on the single statewide toll-free telephone number. That is, you contact immediately, if you suspect child abuse, you contact immediately the Department of Child and Family Services via their website or their 1-800 telephone number. This is important. This is the protocol that you will write down on that test, and you will know in terms of reporting child abuse. Now, this is the protocol if you suspect someone outside the school of committing child abuse. For school district employee allegations, some of this doesn't make sense to me, but this is what the protocol is, and I'll tell you why it's important to follow it, because we have a case important case here. I'll get to that in a second. School district employee allegations. In any incident involving a substantiated allegation of child abuse by a school district employee, the principal or director of the employee's school or department shall notify the superintendent immediately and shall follow this notification with a written report of investigative and disciplinary actions, if any, taken within 2 working days. So if you suspect someone within the school of committing child abuse, any staff member, teacher, or someone, school district employee, you are to report the incident to the principal, who then reports it to basically the director of HR, Human Resources, and then Resources will send it to will contact in the same time superintendent and then the Department of Child and Family Services. This is important. There was a case in Kissimmee, elementary school in Kissimmee, in which there was allegations of child abuse against a teacher. A teacher tells the principal, who in turn informs the HR department, and they call the police. The principal and other HR people, the cops show up and arrest the principal and other human resources personnel, saying that they had violated the protocol, that they hadn't called Department of Child and Family Services immediately. Well, after costly and lengthy litigation, it was determined that they had in fact followed what the state had laid out. So it's important that you know what the two procedures are. If you suspect someone outside the context of the school, a parent, family member, someone outside being a school employee or district employee, then you are to immediately contact Department of Child and Family Services via the 1-800 or website. If you suspect someone who is a school of child abuse, who is a school district employee, you are to contact the principal. This protocol is important to remember. Okay, that will do it for this video. Next time and the next will be the last video for the course. I will discuss teachers and students' Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights, and then FERPA, the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, requirements for teachers. Okay, have a good day.